I'm here to talk to you today about change. Change on a broad spectrum, whether it be in your own personal life or as a collaborative human effort to guide industry into a more prosperous and sustainable future. The thing I'm going to focus on today is change in the apparel industry and how you as a consumer have incredible power to facilitate that change. Now, I'm an avid surfer. Avid definitely being interchangeable with addict. And some of the best waves in the world are located in some of the least developed countries, which I've been traveling to since my early 20s. Now, traveling did a lot for me in respect to my own personal life, my own mental health. But one of the more lasting effects was the fact that it opened up my eyes to some of our dirty human habits. I'll never forget the first time that I paddled through garbage in Indonesia. It was an eye-opening experience for a privileged kid from Canada. This problem of waste is just not something we deal with here on a regular basis. It's so well hidden by our infrastructure. It's in the bin, out the door, never think of it again. At first, this motivated me to take a look at my own purchasing behavior and whether or not I was part of the problem. And it eventually inspired me to spend the last 5 years of my life trying to change one of the industries with the biggest impact, the apparel industry. And right now in the apparel industry, we have a broken system. Fashion is responsible for more carbon output than all international air travel and maritime shipping combined. It's also the second largest consumer of water in the world. Right now, the UN expects that just by 2025, 30% of the world will face water shortage. Now, two of the most common items produced in the fashion industry are jeans and a t-shirt. In order to make this outfit, even out of organic cotton, it takes 12,000 liters of water. That's enough water to sustain someone for 7 years. And on a brink of a global water crisis, we produced 80 billion pieces of clothing last year. Now, of that 80 billion, only 70% of it actually reached a consumer. The other 30%, well, the cost of production is now so cheap, it actually makes more sense for companies to deliberately overproduce and then burn unsold product than risk not meeting demand. Once that product reaches the consumer, the problem isn't over there. These cheap, low-quality clothes have such a short life cycle now that on average, we're each throwing out around 70 pounds a year. Thrift shops in Canada are so overwhelmed, they only sell about a quarter of what's donated now. The result is a dump truck of garbage being landfilled, a dump truck of clothing being landfilled every single second around the world. Billions and billions of pounds piling up, enough to actually fill Sydney Harbor annually. We have a broken system in the apparel industry right now, and this is headed in a pretty dark direction. But there is a solution, and it comes in the way of the circular economy. And right now, when you buy a piece of clothing, it's pretty much a linear path from the producer through you, maybe a couple of others if we're lucky, to landfill. Circular model says that you buy a piece of clothing, it's made from recycled or upcycled materials, you use it, you recycle it, and that material is used to make a new product. This essentially eliminates a lot of our dependence on the natural resources associated with clothing production. It also has the potential to offset billions of pounds of waste that we're sending to landfill every year. Now, up until recently, this was a bit of a pipe dream for the apparel industry. The technology just didn't exist, but not anymore. We can now recycle up to 95% of textiles. Now, as technology has continued to be developed, the key to making this possible is designing products with the end of their life in mind. That's something that people like me are working on. But right now, there is an entire movement of brands either incorporating this partially or fully into their processes and creating almost every single apparel item that you can imagine. There's companies turning recycled billboards into bags, recycled fishnets into waterproof jackets, and marine plastic into running shoes. There's companies turning recycled water bottles into hats, backpacks, jeans, everything you can imagine, and companies using pre- and post-consumer waste to create 100% recycled apparel. The future of fashion is closing these loops, waste to resource and back again. Now, with these technologies in play, we don't need to produce using systems that are heavily reliant on water anymore. And by doing so, we're not only not solving the solid waste problem, but we're now unnecessarily using natural resources. So hands up if you have bought something before because it was just such a good deal, you couldn't resist. Maybe on Friday. Now, hands up if you have something in your closet that you haven't worn in a really long time, and you kind of don't know what to do with it. Lastly, hands up if you bought something for one specific event and you haven't worn it since. My hand is up for all three of these. I'm certainly no saint. In fact, I actually thought about it before coming here today. I thought, these shoes are pretty worn out. I probably shouldn't wear these on stage. Even though they're completely functional shoes, something deep inside me told me that you guys would think of me as less professional unless I had a fresh pair of kicks on. It's so ingrained in us, it comes from somewhere so deep that we're not even rationally thinking about it anymore. It starts with external influence through marketing and pop culture. And then it's the internal desire to fit in, be cool, be accepted, and ultimately feel good. And finally, it's that little dopamine burst you get when buying. And this is where it starts with us, the consumer, changing our own habits. Now, this is the diffusion of innovation curve, and it's the life cycle that every single product takes from inception to maturity in the market. And in order for a product or idea to become mainstream, it needs to complete the curve, so to speak. Right now, I think we're somewhere around here, between innovators and early adopters. And that is the category that you will all leave here in today if I'm any good at this. This is the tipping point on the curve, or the chasm as it's called. And once we reach this point, and the idea begins to be adopted by the early majority, it's likely that it will stay. The cost to the consumer will decrease as the idea reaches economies of scale. Government policy will catch up and will tip over into the late majority. Your decisions of what you buy in the apparel industry have maybe never been so influential. Now, although capitalism doesn't always result in the net positive, there is one major benefit when the population is educated. And that is that the people, the consumer, you and me, we get to decide which products live and which products die. This is an economic principle called dollar voting, and it's where all your power lies to influence the progression through this curve. Every time you go to the store or shop online, you're participating in an election of sorts, not for a political party, but for companies that you believe in. And you should be considering the dollars that you spend as carefully as you consider the ballot that you put in the box every 4 years, because it has at least as much, if not more, influence on your future. This is something that's very easily overlooked when we need or want a new t-shirt, and there's one right there for $5. Now, I admit, it's quite overwhelming to try to figure out what's environmentally friendly, what's ethical. I mean, I just want to buy clothes that I like, right? But there's actually a few very simple things, relatively simple things, that you as a consumer can do that can work to push us past that tipping point. I'll start with the least popular idea that I'm going to propose today. We need to start paying more for our clothes. This is the consumer price index alongside the average price of clothing. As the CPI has climbed, we've had a nearly stagnant, actually declining clothing price for almost 30 years. How is this possible? How is one product not affected by the cost of everything associated with producing it? The answer to that question is two declining costs: labor and quality. When fast fashion came into play and basically we had this race to the bottom for price, transparency disappeared, and supply chains got so long and murky and riddled with outsourcing that the companies often don't even know who's producing their clothes. And at the same time, disposable clothing became acceptable to the consumer. And once that happened, cheap, low quality, and environmentally costly practices and fabric took over. Our unwillingness to pay more for our clothes will continue to result in disasters like the Rana Plaza collapse, and many of the exploited labor scandals that you're familiar with, and many that you're not. For decades now, this has warped our perception of the cost of clothing. We're so accustomed to seeing t-shirts for $5 or $10. It seems extortionate to pay 40 or 50. It's not. The way I like to look at it is like this. When looking at a product category, say t-shirts for example, every single garment costs the same. Either the people who made it pay for it, the planet pays for it, or the consumer pays for it. It's up to you to decide. Now, in particular, clothing that incorporates these circular models will cost more at the start until we reach that tipping point, those economies of scale that will make the small brands competitive with the big ones. Perfect example of this is the mobile phone. 1983, the first mobile phone cost $4,000 US. First desktop computer was $3,200. Now I can get a mobile phone with a computer inside of it for $300. Now, depending on your economic situation, you may or may not have the ability to be one of the first adopters. But everybody in this room today absolutely does. I'm not asking you to go out and spend $4,000 on a t-shirt, but I am asking you to consider not spending $20. Now, all of this said, There are still luxury brands out there creating absolute crap with extortionate markups. So higher cost isn't always associated with more environmentally or ethical. And that brings me to my next point. We need to change who we buy from. Actually, more importantly, we need to be aware of who we're buying from. Right now, the customer journey of a clothing purchase goes something like this. Yeah, I like that. I think it would look good on me. And then we check the price. Yes, I can afford that. And then third, we maybe look at the brand and its values and whether they align with us. We need to take number 3 and make it number 1. The brands I told you about before, they don't have 6,000 square foot stores, and they certainly don't sell t-shirts for $10. So to get us over that chasm, you're going to have to temporarily sacrifice some convenience. Conscious consumerism means searching out brands that align with your values, not just buying something because it's available or temporarily perceived as cool. I think if most people understood the impact that their choice of cheap clothing was making on other humans, they would seriously reconsider it. So as well as looking for brands that incorporate a circular model, this also means looking for brands that are transparent. They share their manufacturers. They tell you how much they pay their employees abroad. They share their ideology behind their fabric choices. They have ethics that they stand behind, and they're aware of their own impact and trying to minimize it. And we live in an incredible time where all this information is at our fingertips online. And if it's not, we have a direct line to the brands in the public forum of social media. By spending just 5 minutes to look for this information, and if it's not there, calling out the brands that you want to buy from could not only dramatically improve, but it could save someone's life in the long run. Now, I have a vision that one day you're going to be able to walk into a retail store with your phone and scan the tag on a shirt and see the entire supply chain of a garment, right down to the picture of the person who sewed it. We do this right now in my company, and I hope it's something that the consumer comes to demand from every single brand. The last thing I'm going to talk about today is maybe the hardest, because it requires a degree of introspection and maybe some personal change. And it's actually a question that I want you to ask yourself when you're going to go buy clothing next. Why am I buying this? Seems ridiculously simple, right? But thinking about this critically is actually a way of moving it from your emotional, impulsive brain and into your logical one. Now, we all raised our hands before for some pretty common pitfalls, and the reason we did that was because a lot of the time we're buying things not because the product serves a purpose for us, but because the purchase does. Buying triggers the pleasure center in our brain and releases dopamine. We're actually addicted to consumerism. And I think this is associated with dissatisfaction in other areas of our lives. It definitely was for me. So here's something to think about. Recent studies showed that the biggest spike in dopamine or happiness actually occurs in anticipation of buying and then rapidly declines afterwards. A study compared this to experiential spending and found the inverse. When the individual spent money on an experience, happiness actually increased over time instead of decreasing. We keep our clothes for just half as long as we did 15 years ago. In our relationship with clothing, it's become a disposable one. There's no doubt in my mind that by buying less with a focus on quality is maybe the biggest impact that you can make. Now, I'm standing up here today telling you how to be a more conscious consumer, but I wasn't always this way. In fact, I was the polar opposite of this. When I was younger, I had my life pretty mapped out for me. I loved the idea of business. I loved the idea of money. Dreamt of big houses, fancy cars, expensive suits. My thought process on my impact on the planet or industry was literally the furthest thing from my mind. I've always been an entrepreneur, and when I was 16, I started my own company, and I had my first little taste of success. What was the first thing I did? I went out and bought a $2,000 suit that I think I wore once. Turns out a landscaper doesn't have much use for a $2,000 suit. There's actually a point in my life where I would go out and buy a new shirt every Friday because I didn't like doing laundry. I would go back and slap that version of myself if I could. But then I had a turning point in my own life, something that shook my value system to its core. Bummed a ride home one day from school from a good friend and hockey teammate at the time. We opened it up on a back road. I remember like it was yesterday, looking over as the speedometer ticked past 150. We lost control on a wet patch of ice and we left the road doing around 170. We hit a tree and Pete died beside me in the car that day. And I miraculously walked away with 7 stitches. This took the whole picture that I had for my life and it shattered it. I carried on for a little while. I actually pursued an education to be an investment banker, of all things. And I was society's perfect little picture of a promising young man. But in reality, the guilt of living that day, combined with the fact that everything I was chasing no longer seemed to matter to me, sent me into a deep and spiraling depression. I first tried to deal with this with drugs and alcohol, and I eventually got to the point where I completely understood the mindset of somebody who's ready to take their own life. And then I made a big change in my own life. I sold everything I had and I started traveling, and that decision ultimately brought me before you today, talking not about profit-driven business, but purpose-driven. I always reflect on, if I were to die tomorrow, would I be happy with how I live today? And at first the answer to that question was minimum responsibility and maximum happiness every day of my life, something I became very good at. But as I grow older, the answer to that question has grown to hinge on my ability to leave a positive impact on the people around me, and most importantly, the planet that I've fallen so in love with exploring. So if I can leave you with one thought today, it's that whether we're talking about your own personal life, changing to work towards a happier version of yourself, or whether we're talking about working together as a community to drive industry into a more promising future, I hope I've shown you that you have incredible power to facilitate that change with small daily decisions that you make every day. Don't be ignorant of your power as an individual to make our generation the one that radically redefines what's important to us as a society. Thank you, guys.